I'd kill them. Why not just leave them be?
Dead people can't be infected.
Hello and welcome to my Last of Us HBO Spoilercast, where each week we react to the latest episode and talk in depth about what we've watched. I'm Phil, or AK Black and Red, and on this channel I talk about The Last of Us a lot, along with other survival and horror themed video games. So if that's your thing, then be sure to subscribe. As the name implies, spoilers lie ahead for the third episode of the HBO series, so if you haven't watched it yet, then I highly recommend you do before proceeding. You don't have to have played the game to follow along, although be aware there may be some spoilers for the chapter of the game that this episode of the show covers, since the two do deviate in particular aspects. Normally, I'd be diving in with guests, however this week, various factors have meant that it just didn't work with everyone's availability, so instead I'm going to give my thoughts on one of the most impactful episodes of television that I've seen in a good while. Talking in generalities first, this was... in some sense, it was a breather episode and a bottle episode since it was mostly contained within the one area. However, despite that, and despite a lot of people sort of maybe perhaps seeing this as kind of filler compared to the main story of Joel and Ellie, there was an awful lot within this that built up the world of The Last of Us, a lot of world building, and also a lot of stuff that kind of connected to the game, which I'll talk about in a sec as well. But basically, when we got this story, which was kind of framed on both sides by kind of Joel and Ellie arriving at Billstown and then leaving Billstown at the end, and in the middle we had this story of Bill and Frank. In that, we got to see over a truncated course of a 20-year time span, we got to see an awful lot of stuff about how the world's moved on, what the world has done since the outbreak happens, because in the first episode, and to a degree the second episode, we see that these quarantine zones have been set up, that they're run by the military, federal, under martial law, but we haven't really seen anything else. We don't know what happened when these zones were created and what was left behind, and we see a lot of that here, and we see a lot of kind of how Bill ended up with the town all to himself, and how all of this came to be, and also the fate of a lot of people who maybe didn't fit in the quarantine zones and this sort of thing. But we've also seen that beyond the quarantine zones now, we know a lot more danger lurks around, and we see that there are humans who raid other humans to try and gather resources from them and steal from them and survive in that kind of way. So we see that they're as much of a threat as the infected, who we don't really see again in this episode. So this kind of builds upon the series' themes of love, which is obviously central not only to this episode, but also to the whole story running through, and this idea of love being the kind of main driving force of human actions, and not always being positive, and being something that people can react to in an awful lot of different ways, not always in good ways. And the need for people to be protected, and the danger that the world poses, all of that is kind of comes together, and it is a key part of this whole story, which, aside from all that, and obviously the center of it being this love story between Bill and Frank, is extremely, at times, there's plenty of funny moments in it. There's moments where you will sit there and laugh out loud as the interactions and kind of the banter that happens between them characters, but there's also plenty of heartfelt moments where certainly more than once, just kind of from something happening that was a bit happy or romantic or a bit of a surprise, I did feel myself tearing up a couple of times. And then obviously there's the more emotional side where it's absolutely gut-wrenchingly emotional as well, and quite sad and bittersweet towards the end. So there's an awful lot of that in there, and that was done exceptionally well from how everything was set up and the way that the score was used within the scenes and within the television show. The framing of some of the shots and the way everything kind of came together and how it looked and felt. And obviously at the centre of that, these fantastic performances, particularly by Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett, who just absolutely gave their all and lent into these characters so much that genuinely, like, I can't sing their praises high enough for everything that we saw in this. And I think particularly Nick Offerman as Bill and the nuances that he gave to that character, not just in terms of dialogue delivered and how it was delivered, and sort of at the end, obviously, when we see kind of Bill and Frank coming to the end of their lives and the end of their relationship and the tears and everything else, but also right at the start and kind of the subtleness, like how he kind of switches from the level of confidence that he's moving with when he's setting up this town in isolation, and he's building his walls, and he's said goodbye to the government, and he's happy to become his own man and be self-sustained, and he's watching infected die by his traps and all that sort of stuff, to the level of discomfort and how far out of his normal comfort zone he is once he's with Frank and he's talking to another human being, and these feelings are coming to the surface, and you can see there's something inside that he's wrestling with inside of himself that is obviously never said explicitly, but you can see and you can feel that from the way he acts, from his body language, from the facial expressions and everything, and kind of the level to which he's been kind of repressed or closeted or whatever else, and also quite restrained because he's got a certain view of the world, and having himself brought out of that by another human being, and kind of seeing that discomfort then gradually melt away into something he's more comfortable with than anything he's ever been comfortable with in his life. All of that stuff is all conveyed without, there's no monologue, there's no explicit kind of lay it out, but that's just absolutely some of the most fantastic performance that I've seen. And yeah, it was just absolutely brilliant, that whole section. I think the other thing that this episode does quite well as giving us that love story and giving us that self-contained thing and building these two characters up essentially from scratch to the point where their loss breaks your heart, is, and doing so in a way that tells us so much more about the world that Joel and Ellie are going to be traveling through, and doing so in a way that kind of builds upon the themes that are central to the story. It also does an awful lot in terms of foreshadowing what's going to come later, and I'm not going to kind of spoil anything that'll happen past this episode for anyone who doesn't know what to expect from the game. But in essence, the way this is done, it's done in Bill's town in the game as well, but in a very different way. In that version, the Bill we see is one who's lost his Frank. He's very much more the kind of the bitter, lonely, jaded survivalist that Bill in the episode is at the start, rather than one who's let parts of himself, kind of some of those walls, be torn down. And in that, Bill kind of serves as the extreme end of what we see from Joel, and we see from Joel's kind of closed offness and his unwillingness to put himself out on a limb because of the loss he's suffered. Bill represents the furthest extremes of that, and what he'll become if he doesn't start to open himself up and he doesn't start to build this relationship that he's got with Ellie and become, over the course of that game and that journey, a better person in that way. So Bill's kind of like a warning in that sense, whereas here, the same foreshadowing pushes in a different direction, and we get from Bill's letter at the end this speech about this is why men like us exist, to protect those who need to be protected. And it serves the same basic purpose underneath that, is to kind of pushing Joel in the direction that he's going to be going as far as his arc in the series and his role towards Ellie. But it a lot more heavily foreshadows what's to come, and we can see that in terms of not just what's said and the relationship that we know that they are building, but also in the performances of Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey as Joel looks towards Ellie as she's reading this and that line, and you can kind of see that connection's already starting to form in his mind, and we know that that's the direction that he's going, and he's taken on that role, the protector. And obviously the story is then about where that leads and how that evolves over time. So yeah, it essentially, what I'm going to try and say is that although these two versions of Bill's Town play out very differently in terms of what Joel and Ellie do while they're there, and also who Bill is because of certain things that have happened or haven't happened between him and Frank, it does the same thing as far as the narrative goes. It pushes them in the same direction. It provides them with the same outcome, and it gives us that same groundwork of foreshadowing, of pointing towards what Joel, the choice that Joel needs to make, essentially, to go from where he is to open himself up and becoming that protector and that father figure for Ellie. So that's done absolutely excellently and superbly, in my opinion. And that kind of leads me on to one of the other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of a general kind of view of this show, because after having watched it, I've seen obviously an awful lot of people have been talking about this when I've been watching on Twitter or TikTok and other places, and the general theme of this is people talking about how much it impacted them emotionally, how much they loved it, and all this sort of thing. But of course, the internet being the internet, there's also kind of these negative responses that come in, and it's not negative responses in terms of just the episode didn't hit right with some people. I mean, I'm sure that may have been the case for some people, but all of the negative responses that I'm talking about are responses that form around essentially the fact that Bill and Frank are gay, and the fact that they have a love story, and that this is portrayed in a way that we maybe haven't seen in mainstream television. I mean, I'm sure it's been seen in different shows that maybe not as mainstream, not as kind of top of the cultural zeitgeist talked about around the water cooler, like the way The Last of Us is, but it's not generally seen the way gay people are generally seen, even today, in a lot of media in this sort of sense, is that they're either background characters, to some degree they're comic relief or stereotypes, and if they have any kind of romance or any kind of story, there's always a lot more tragedy to it. The story of Bill in the games and Frank's fate in that essentially kind of fits into that archetype. The trope of bury your gays, and the show has moved away from that, and that's something that we don't see enough, really. But obviously, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that for either kind of implicit reasons, or in the case of certain people who are making YouTube videos and talking about this sort of stuff, very explicit reasons that they obviously won't necessarily always come out and dress it up as, you know, I don't like gay people and I don't like them being on the television and being centered and having their own stories to tell and being the focus, when it should be about people who are like me, which is ultimately what it does boil down to. This is what's underneath the code whenever anyone kind of invokes this culture war stuff, when they talk about everything getting woke, when it's pushing an agenda or box ticking and all this sort of stuff. That's essentially what they mean. That's the underneath of it. It is people like me are not being centered enough, and therefore this is wrong. This is perverting the way things should be in some sense or other. And that's, I mean, it's predictable, but I think it's also something that I'm glad is getting buried. I mean, I still see it because it's there's still kind of, you know, no matter how much you bury it, these things, that the tendrils pop out from under the ground. But yeah, I thought it was worth mentioning because I think these things are still kind of cutting through, and we need to be aware that there's not really anything legitimate there when people are talking about that. When they're talking about this and it's centered around the fact that the characters involved are gay, it's not about, you know, a critique of the show or whatever. And I'm sure someone could come up with a genuine critique of that episode where they didn't like it and it didn't fit with them for whatever reasons, you know, in terms of pacing or whatever. I can't think of any, because I can't think of any genuine kind of flaws in that. But in theory, there could be something like that. But that's not what this is. And I think the fact that we still have to have that conversation now is really not a good thing. And I think one of the reasons why it's good to have this sort of thing on television is because representation matters. People being able to see their own stories told, and that people who are like them told in that kind of positive and reaffirming way, and not just being side characters, background characters, jokes, tragedies, or worse, kind of something, a figure of hate or something to be completely blotted out is always good. And I think that's actually proven kind of by the fact that certain people complain about representation when what they actually mean is that they don't have a monopoly on representation anymore, and that's kind of where they're coming from, because ultimately, they're essentially kind of on the other side of the coin, and they don't like that. But so I don't want to draw too much attention and dwell too much on that, but I think it's worth noting that these responses still exist. When we see them, they don't deserve to be taken in good faith because they're not made in good faith. They all come from a position of these types of people shouldn't be front and center in the things I like. But also bringing things back to a more positive note, it's not as easy to there are, although these things are there, they have been buried by huge, overwhelming amounts of positive responses to this episode, and I think that we can take as a good thing. As much as these things are always there every single time a new property comes out, and it's got people in it who right-wing culture warriors don't like, same sort of thing. But the more and more that this grift goes on, it's getting buried by when these stories are told really well, people responding to that in a positive way. And so that's kind of good. That's me on my soapbox. Moving away from that as well, like I say, I think the reason the differences from the game work in this episode are because they still fulfill the same story functions, and they still give us the same outcome in terms of pushing the narrative along, whilst doing so in a way that I think adds a huge amount to Bill as a character and to his backstory, and to Bill and Frank as characters. And one of the things I did see described was this idea that the Bill in the game and the Bill in the show essentially took different paths at that point, where Bill and Frank are arguing over how they approach the town and whether they want to do things like decorate it up, have friends, reach out to people, and the Bill in the show accepted that, and even though he was uncomfortable with it, and that allowed their relationship to grow, whereas the Bill in the game essentially didn't, and that's why their relationship festered, and Frank grew to hate him and ended up going to leave the town, and obviously meeting his ultimate tragic fate as a result, and probably makes the whole thing even more heartbreaking on some levels. But yeah, that's essentially, I think a really good way of looking at it, and I think that kind of underlines the point that this was really, really well done. This is the most that the show's deviated from the game, and they've done it well enough that it works absolutely perfectly. This week's episode of The Last of Us, as well as being perhaps the best received so far, and I think one of the greatest hours or 80 minutes of TV that we've seen in a good long while, also saw a 6.4 million viewership when it premiered, which is a 12% bump from episode 2, which in turn was a bump up 22% from the first episode of the show. So the show is continuing to grow in leaps and bounds in popularity, which is always good for something of this caliber. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen that season 2 has now been officially confirmed. Last episode of the podcast, we were talking about the rumors that was the case, and now we know for definite that will be the case, and that season 2 will at least start to adapt the story of The Last of Us Part 2. Craig Mazin has said that this is a story that's bigger than one season, whereas The Last of Us Part 1 can be adapted in the one season and the 9 episodes, which is what we're going to see in this season. Season 2 is going to essentially be the first half, perhaps, or the first part of The Last of Us Part 2 story, which is a lot bigger. But nonetheless, fans of the game and fans of the story will be glad to know of that. And it's also interesting that in response to that, there's been a lot of talk on the internet about fan castings of various roles and so on, which I'm not going to kind of go into here because I don't think those things necessarily hold too much weight. And I think, as we've possibly seen with fan castings around Ellie and Joel, and in particular the reaction from some, and quite mean reaction towards Bella Ramsey's casting, even now, I don't hold much weight towards fan castings. However, one thing that we have seen, which I think would be quite cool if it could happen, is that Victoria Grace, the actress who plays Yara in The Last of Us Part 2, has said that she would love to reprise the role. So I'm always kind of a fan of seeing actors who took on the roles originally in games being able to reprise them in some way, shape or form, as we're seeing with Mel Danvridge with Marlene in this season. And even though they're not reprising the same roles, we see that Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson obviously will be in the show. So I think more roles for the actors who gave such great performances in the game in some way or other being incorporated into the show is something to look forward to. And kind of alongside that, the other big news in terms of the show and the show's performances, that there's now an official Last of Us Spotify playlist with all the songs that have come up on the show, and that's up for people to check out. But there has been a 4,900% increase in streams of Linda Ronstadt's Long, Long Time on Spotify as well. Obviously, the song that was central to Bill and Frank's romance has had a huge impact on people. I suppose the kind of last thing there to say, and just to kind of take a moment, is to mention that Annie Wershing, who played Tess in the game, has passed away from cancer at age 45. She was obviously a fantastic actress, not only in a role as Tess, she's also played innumerable roles on television, including in 24, which I think was the first time that I'd seen her in anything. And seeing that she passed away was quite a shock at the time. So don't think there's anything you could kind of say in that situation that does it justice, but just to say that thoughts are with her family and everyone she leaves behind, and it's been heartwarming to see the glowing tributes that those who worked with her and those of her friends have paid to her, and it's definitely a great loss. And finally, if we talk, just to mention what's coming up next week, with episode 4, Joel and Ellie will arrive in Kansas City, which takes the place of Pittsburgh from the game. So they are going to be faced with dangerous human enemies who game players will know as hunters. And this includes a brand new character who's going to be played by Melanie Linsky, whose character is described as a dangerous revolutionary leader. And we've seen a lot of her in the trailers, and we don't entirely know what her role entails yet, but certainly that will be something to look forward to. And I think the Kansas City story arc will probably take place over at least 2 episodes, if not 3, for the reason that the Pittsburgh chapter and then the kind of suburbs and sewer chapter that follow it, in terms of the game's chronology, are then followed by Tommy's Dam, which is where Joel reunites with Tommy. And we know from what we've seen so far that instead of going to the dam, which we see in the game, Joel and Ellie will be going to the city of Jackson, which is the settlement that his brother has set up. And that's slated for episode 7, I believe. So 4 and 5 and possibly 6 will likely take place across the Kansas City story. So we're going to get quite a lot in there. That will be quite exciting to see how that unfolds, and no doubt we'll be left with some very tense cliffhangers, I imagine. Yeah, let me know in the comments what you're hoping to see as far as episode 4 goes, as well as your verdict on episode 3 and your favourite moments from the series so far. That's everything for this week. Next week, like I say, hopefully we'll be back to normal in terms of being joined by guests, and scheduling things will work out a lot better. But for now, if you've enjoyed the podcast, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content, including future episodes. but also other videos on Last of Us, Resident Evil, and horror games, as well as my live streams where I run whole game permadeath challenges on The Last of Us Part 1 and 2. Check out the links in the description to join my Patreon for as little as £1 per month, or donate to my GoFundMe and get your name in the credits of my videos, like those at the end of this video. I want to thank for supporting me and my content. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.